grammar practice activity comes right out of a textbook. It is either a multiple choice question, a fill-in-the-blank question, a matching question, or a sentence completion question. There's nothing wrong with this type of grammar practice activity. However, it's not the only thing you should do with your students so that they can practice their grammar. You want to mix things up so that they can also work with grammar in a more productive, interactive, and ultimately motivating way. In this course, I'll take you through some techniques and activities to use to take your grammar practice activities out of a textbook. Before we jump into looking at these grammar practice activities, I want to back us up a little bit and start with the question, why do we want to give our students the opportunity to practice grammar in the first place? In order to answer this question, I'm going to describe 3 different types of students that you'll see in your grammar classes. As I describe the students, write down notes under Activity 1 on your handout. Student A is very accurate with his or her grammar. They speak very, very carefully and put a lot of thought into each and every sentence that they make in English. So they might sound like this. The other day, I went to the zoo and I saw lots of different animals. So it takes student A a very long time to form these grammatically correct sentences. Student B is very fluent with his or her English, but not necessarily very accurate. There are no hesitations or pauses between words and sentences, but there are a lot of errors in the language that student B produces. So student B might sound something like this. Yesterday I go to the zoo, really interested. Saw many animals, monkeys, lions, tigers, bears, super fun. So you can see there were grammatical errors, incomplete sentences, wrong word endings, and so on. So this is student B. Student C is really interesting. He or she uses very accurate grammar and is very fluent, but does not use very complex grammatical structures. So student C might sound like this. Yesterday I went to the zoo. It was interesting. I saw many animals. But student C would not be able to integrate something like the past perfect, I have been to the zoo many times, or the past progressive, while I was walking, I tripped. So that's student C, very accurate and very fluent, but does not use complex grammar. These are our 3 types of students in our grammar classes. Student A is accurate but not fluent. Student B is fluent but not accurate. And student C is accurate and fluent but doesn't use complex structures. Think about one of the grammar classes that you currently teach and see which students go into each of these student profiles. Looking at these different types of grammar activities that take the practice out of the textbook, keep in mind our 3 student profiles. Think about which student profile would benefit from each of these activities. What does a typical grammar practice activity look like? I'm going to put you to work. On your worksheet in Activity 2, you've got some space to jot down what this typical grammar practice activity looks like. What do the students do and what does the teacher do? And be honest. If you were honest, here's the description you might have written about a typical grammar practice activity. It is done individually. Students have their own textbooks and they work with a pen or pencil to complete the exercises. Maybe they compare their answers with a partner, and then you take the answers up as a class, and then go on to the next grammar practice activity in the textbook. As I said at the beginning of the course, there's nothing wrong with this type of activity, but as an experienced and skilled teacher, you want to take your class beyond this. doesn't just reside in a textbook. It's alive. We use it to communicate. And in your grammar practice activities, you want to give your students the opportunity to experience grammar as this exciting communication tool. You want them motivated to practice their grammar. And we're going to take a look at some activities that allow this to happen. The first activity that gets our students away from their textbooks is one of my favorites. It's called Team Multiple Choice. You'll see a detailed description of this under Activity 3A down at the bottom of your handout on page 2. Here's how this works. Divide your students into groups of 4 or 5. Give each group a set of letter cards, A, B, and C. They look like this. We have A, we have B, and we have C. Then, as the teacher, read out a multiple choice question, including the possible answers A, B, and C. Students work together to decide what the correct answer is. They have 30 seconds to hold up the letter card corresponding to their correct answer, or what they think the correct answer is. Each team that has the correct answer after 30 seconds gets a point, and the team with the most points wins. Here's an example of what this looks like. I have a list of questions, and they're multiple choice questions. I'm going to read the beginning and then the 3 options and give the groups 30 seconds to hold up the answer they think is right. Number 1, if he had not taken his gloves off, A, he would have gotten frostbite, B, he would not have gotten frostbite, or C, he had gotten frostbite. Groups that hold up the correct answer, B, would get a point in this case. There's a fun variation on this activity. Instead of giving the groups of students 3 choices, A, B, and C, you're simply going to give them a sentence that is either grammatically correct or grammatically incorrect. And instead of a set of letters, they have a check mark and an X that look like this. There's your check mark and there's your X. So if they think the sentence is grammatically correct, they hold up the check mark. If they think the sentence is grammatically incorrect, they hold up the X. And once again, they get points for being correct, and the team with the most points wins. Our next activity is called Team Fill in the Blank. This is activity 3B on your handout down at the bottom of page 3. Here's how this one works. Once again, put your students into groups of 3, 4, or 5 students. Give each group a stack of scrap paper and a marker. Then, as the teacher, you'll say different sentences out loud one at a time, but you'll leave blanks. Students have to work together as a group to correctly fill in the blank. If they get it correct, they get a point, and the team with the most points wins. Here's an example of what this looks like. I have just taught my class the difference between simple past and present perfect when we're talking about events in the past. I give them this sentence: Mark blank a writer soon after graduating. If groups hold up a piece of paper that says became, they would get a point because I want to use simple past here. If they held up a piece of paper that says has become, they would not get a point because I don't want to use present perfect in this situation. The next activity, activity 3C, is called Running Grammar Practice. You'll see a detailed description of this on page 4 of your handout. Here's how this one works. Photocopy an activity from your grammar textbook. Take the activity and cut it up into slips of paper so that you have one question or one sentence on each slip of paper. Take some tape and go around your classroom and tape the questions in different places. Be tricky, make some of these questions hard to find. Next, divide your students up into pairs and give each pair an answer sheet. Their job is to split up and go around the class, find each of these questions, answer it in their heads, run back to their desks, and write down the correct answers. The first pair that has a correct answer sheet wins the competition. Here's how this one works. I've given you a sample grammar practice activity on page 4 of your handout. In this activity, students have to take the verb in brackets and make sure that it's in the correct tense. So I've taken these questions and put them all over the classroom. For example, when students find number 10, they're going to read it and they have to come up with the sentence, "If you meet a bear, run," run back to their seats and write down that sentence. And they would do the same for all of the other questions that they find. Activity number 3D is called word order activity. You'll find the instructions for this at the top of page 5 of your handout. Here's how this one works. Put your students into groups and give each group a stack of cards. On each card is one single word. Students have to work together in their groups to make as many sentences as possible only using the words on those cards. One person in the group should be designated as the scribe, and they write down all of the sentences that the group comes up with. After a certain amount of time, you can give them 5 minutes or 10 minutes, bring the class together and confirm all of the possible sentences that are correct from this set of words. And the group with the most correct sentences wins the activity. Activity 3E is called oral drills. The instructions for this are given in detail on page 5 of your handout. Over the years, oral drills have kind of gotten a bad rap, especially since people really focus now on communicative language teaching. People thought, well, oral drills don't really have anything to do with communication. But there is a place in your grammar class for oral drills because they're so focused on accuracy, and they also get students very automatic with the language that you're practicing. So let's take a look at how this works. In oral drills, your students are all going to be saying the same thing either all together as a class, or you'll divide them into 2 parts within the class. But no one student is performing on his or her own in an oral drill. In order to demonstrate this, I'm kind of going to have to split myself into a teacher role and a student role. So I'll tell you when I'm being the teacher and when I'm being the student. I have just taught my students the difference between how much for non-count nouns and how many for count nouns. So how much milk versus how many apples. And I want to get them automatic in making this choice. So here's what I'm going to do. First of all, I'm going to drill my students on the question for non-count nouns. So I will say, how much milk do we have? And my students will repeat, how much milk do we have? And I'll do this 4 or 5 times. How much milk do we have? How much milk do we have? Back and forth, so that students are automatic in how much. Then I'm going to switch up the non-count noun that I use. So instead of milk, I'm simply going to say the word rice. And then my students have to come up with the question, how much rice do we have? Then I'll give the prompt coffee, and my students have to say, how much coffee do we have? And I give the prompt wine, and my students come up with, how much wine do we have? So I'll do this with about 8 or 9 different non-count nouns, once again to get my students automatic with this question. When I'm sure that my students are automatic with the question for non-count nouns, I'm going to introduce the question for count nouns. So I will say, how many bananas do we have? And my students will repeat, how many bananas do we have? And we'll go back and forth, how many bananas, back and forth, 4 or 5 times until that question is automatic. As the next step, I'm going to introduce prompts of different count nouns. And my students have to take the prompt and make the correct count noun question. So I may say apples, and my students will say, how many apples do we have? I may say potatoes, how many potatoes do we have? Onions, how many onions do we have? And I'll do this with 8 or 9 count nouns. Now comes the tricky stage of the oral drill. I'm going to mix up my prompts, and my students have to pick the correct question to go with the prompt that I provide. So I might start with a non-count prompt, rice, how much rice do we have? And then I'll switch it to a count noun prompt, bananas, how many bananas do we have? And I'll just mix it up, making sure that my students produce the correct question to go with either the non-count or the count prompt. As the final step in my oral drills, I'll have my students work in pairs rather than as a whole class. In pairs, one student will provide the prompt, which is either a count or a non-count noun, and the other student has to make the question that goes with the prompt, and then they'll switch roles. At the end of the process of the oral drills, my students have become both very accurate with how much and how many, and also very automatic. They can produce these questions very, very quickly just with minimal prompting. That's the objective of my oral drills. There are two sets of variations that you can use to add more fun to your oral drills. The first set of variations is all about how you speak or how your students speak. So you can change up the volume, have everybody speak very loudly or very softly. You can change up the speed, speaking very quickly or very slowly. You can change the intonation, have it kind of contradict what you're saying. You can change the accent, have everyone speak with a British accent or for fun an Australian accent. And you can change the emotion behind what you're saying. Have everyone speak as if they're angry or happy or also even drunk. You can have some fun with that too. The second set of variations is about who speaks when. So you can have your oral drills where everyone in the class speaks at the same time, or you can split it into side A of the classroom and side B, or you can split it into all the male students and all the female students. So these are some different variations in terms of who speaks when. There are two things to keep in mind as you're using oral drills in your grammar class. The first one is to keep the pace lively. Don't let it drag and slow down because then it just becomes a really boring rote exercise. And the second thing is don't let it drag on too long. Oral drills should just be a very fast, quick activity that injects some energy into your grammar class. The final activity I'm going to introduce to you is activity 3F, substitution charts. Like oral drills, substitution charts used to be popular and then they kind of went out of fashion, but it really is time to bring them back into your teaching repertoire. A substitution chart is a chart that you put on the board so that all your students can see it, and it allows students to construct a variety of sentences and always be correct. So a substitution chart has columns, and in each column you put a specific part of a sentence with some possible variations or alternatives. Students then move across the chart selecting from the different options to create a correct sentence. If you take a look at the top of page 6 of your handout, you'll see an example of a substitution chart. Here's how you use a substitution chart. Put your students into groups of 3 or 4 and give them the task of creating as many accurate sentences as possible from the information in the substitution chart. Here are some example correct sentences that students could make from the substitution chart given at the top of page 6. One of these sentences could be, one person in our group is going to work abroad. So I've picked one piece from each column of the chart to make a correct sentence. I just have a warning about using substitution charts. Substitution charts are actually more difficult to create than you might think. So making your chart is not something that you want to leave to the last minute. And you always want to test it. Make sure that all of the sentences students could make by using your substitution chart are actually correct. Now it's time for you to do some work. Think about a grammar target that you have to teach in the coming weeks. Create a grammar practice activity that uses one of the ideas I've presented in this video and take your grammar practice out of your textbook. Back to the beginning and think about our students, student A, B, and C. Remember, student A is accurate but not fluent, student B is fluent but not accurate, and student C is fluent, accurate, but doesn't use complex grammar structures. Which ones of the activities that I've presented in this video help which students? Student A needs activities that are going to help with fluency. The best activity for fluency is oral drills. This helps students get very, very automatic with their language. Substitution charts also help with fluency. Student B needs grammar practice activities that focus on accuracy. So some of the activities I've presented that will help student B are team multiple choice, team fill in the blank, and word order. Student C needs to build up the complexity of the grammatical structures that he or she uses. So activities that will help student C include team multiple choice, word order, and running grammar practice. Many teachers by default rely solely on the grammar practice activities found in their textbooks. Using the activities presented in this video, you can take your grammar teaching to the next level and make grammar come alive for your students.